Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's plenary session From Roots to Ancestry, Doing Black Family History. Today, we will have a great discussion with, got caught off, with three wonderful genealogists and historians on family. My name is Lopez Jr., and I'm the digital production librarian for the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, and also the chair of the Publications Committee for ASALH, and the chair of the ASALH TV Committee. Our first discussant with us today is Dr. Deborah Newman-Ham, and Dr. Newman-Ham received a BA in History from Howard University in 1970 and received her master's from Boston University in 1971. She also completed a PhD at Howard University. After graduating, she spent the summer as an intern at the National Archives, and in 1972 began work as an archivist and Black history specialist at the National Archives. While there, she helped co-found the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society in 1977. In 1986, she moved to the Library of Congress, working as the specialist in African-American history and culture in the manuscript division. While at the Library of Congress, she was the curator of the exhibit African-American Odyssey, Quest for Full Citizenship, and edited the catalog of the exhibit. In 1995, she left the Library of Congress to become a professor of history at Morgan State University, a position she held until her retirement in 2016. In 2011, Ham received an Voice Award from the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for excellence in historical research. Her publication, Black History, a Guide, has won several awards, including awards from the Society of American Archivists and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. And on a personal note, I would like to say that she was also on my dissertation committee. Our next presenter, or our next speaker, is Elizabeth Clark Lewis, a professor of history at Howard University. Since 1990, she has directed its public history program. The former director of graduate studies, she has served on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians and as the national director of the Association of Black Women Historians. She is also one of the co-founders of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. Professor Clark Lewis authored Keep It Locked, 106 Tributes to A.J. Calloway, Synergy, Public History at Howard University, Emerging Voices and Paradigms, Black Women's Scholarship, First Freed, Emancipation in the District of Columbia, Living In, Living Out, African-American Domestics in Washington, D.C., and Northern Virginia Community College and Oral History, 1965 to 1985, and the transition from live-in to day work. Elizabeth Clark Lewis has written 21 articles for scholarly publications. As a co-producer of Freedom Bags, a 1990 WETA PBS documentary, she received the Oscar Micheaux Best Documentary Award. And she was the chair of my dissertation committee, again on a personal note. Our final discussant is Dr. Kendra Tierra Field, an associate professor of history and Africana studies and director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University. Field is the author of Growing Up with the Country, Family, Race, and Nation After the Civil War, interweaving Black, White, and Native Creek family histories. The book traces her own ancestors' migratory lives between the Civil War and the Great Migration. Field also served as assistant editor to David Leving Lewis's W.B. Du Bois, A Biography. Her current book project, The Stories We Tell, is about the African-American genealogical quest from the Middle Passage through the present. In 2019 to 2020, Field convened a Mellon Sawyer seminar on the politics of kinship, defamiliarizing the family, genealogy and kinship as critical method. Field has been awarded fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Huntington Library, and Harvard University's Charles Warren Center in American History, and is the recipient of the Western Writers of America's Spur Award for Best Western Short Nonfiction, the Bowen Wilkes Prize, and the OAH's Huggins Quarles Award. Field has advised and appeared in historical documentaries, including Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, and Roots, A History Revealed. Field received her PhD in American History from New York University, a master's in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and a BA from Williams College. Previously, Field served as assistant professor of history at the University of California, Riverside, and worked in education and organizing in Boston and New York. Field is the historical consultant to Clinton Church Restoration, an emerging museum and cultural center dedicated to the life and legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. And I wanted to make sure to read their biographies in totality, just so you understand that these are three discussants very well versed in genealogy, just so you understand who you're hearing from and you understand that you're listening to people who are masters in their field. So thank you all for joining us. And this plenary session is going to be arranged like a conversation. So we're not going to be doing formal presentations and talking at you. We're going to be having a conversation about genealogy and its importance in the remembrance of family history, but also in the remembrance of the African American community and the Black experience. And so I'm going to begin with just a general question for each of you and just ask, how did you begin doing genealogy and begin doing genealogical research? And I guess I'll call on one person. I guess first person I'll call on, since you're on my screen right now, is Dr. Clark Lewis.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I hope so.
We can.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I appreciate your introduction. I think that in terms of starting, and for me, I always make the distinction that I'm not just a genealogist. I consider myself a family historian. Genealogists are interested in names, but family historians want to place individuals within the context, the broader context of history, and that's always what I've done with my research. I started as a graduate student. I was in the class of Dr. Harold Lewis, and Dr. Lewis insisted that we do a major project with primary records, and I decided I was going to use oral history. And because I was a Ford Fellow, and Dr. Lorraine Williams, who supported my research, which was looking at enslaved family history and oral history, she always would refer to what I was doing as innovative. At that point, very few people were working with oral records, and very, very few people were working with African American oral history. And I decided to look at a family in context, my own family, and most importantly, in my larger research, I did a long interview with Dr. Benjamin Quarles at Morgan. I didn't have a car, I took the train and 3 buses, but I was determined to do the interview. And he was very kind. He interviewed for a very long time with me. And one of the things that struck me, to make me comfortable, he talked about where I was from, and I was telling him a little bit about my project. And he was the first person to talk about Alex Haley to me, and doing the kind of family history research Alex Haley was doing. And that meant I continued to do the research, and eventually, upon finishing my master's at Howard as a Ford Fellow, I was able to I went from May being a student to August starting at Northern Virginia. And as a family historian, I was able at the end of that first year to go to the National Archives Genealogical Institute. It was a month-long intensive, all day and many, many evenings. We learned every kind of genealogy, Asian, Jewish, German, et cetera. And they, for the first time, were including African Americans. And it was there that I reconnected. I already knew Dr. Deborah Newman-Ham. We're both from Central Pennsylvania, although I'm from Harrisburg and she's from the small community of York. And we knew each other, but because of us both being at the archives, it gave us a unique opportunity to again connect. And for me, I was taught by the most amazing individual in terms of family history that I met, Mr. James Walker, who helped us become a network. Paul Sluby, Jean Sampson Scott, myself, Dr. Newman-Ham, a number of us who were doing what was considered unbelievable, to dare to say that not only African Americans had history, family history, but that we could create family history based on oral sources. So I very much have been connected with Dr. Ham, Newman Ham, and my work has always been greatly enhanced by her and her peerless knowledge of archives and records. It has just been a delight to always work with her and to be co-founders of the largest African American genealogical society, I think, in the world. I think we'll both admit we thought it was going to be maybe 10, 15 people in Washington. We never, ever dreamt it was going to move and become the size that it is today. With so many chapters and uh, members, it's daunting when you think of it. I hope I answered your question.
You most certainly did. I guess with that, it's a great transition into you, Dr. Newman Ham. How did you come to do this work?
Hi. I am not a genealogist, but I got a summer internship in 1970 when I graduated from Howard at the archives. And they were already revving up for the bicentennial and looking forward. I was introduced to all different kinds of genealogical work. I went away to graduate school in Boston and worked at a regional archives in Waltham, Massachusetts, and then got a full-time job in 72. At that time, two major things had happened. One, the Archivist of the United States had promised the African American scholarly community that the archives would work on doing a guide to Black history records in the archives. And also, they were planning a conference on Black history, which included many of the well-known names of the day, but the most important one to mention today is Alex Haley. Now, Alex Haley was already very popular because of his work with Malcolm X, but everybody was just, as he talked about Kunta Kinte, and if you've ever had the opportunity to hear him speak live or now to hear him on tape, he was an absolutely fascinating, mesmerizing speaker. He could just, you were it with Kumbi Balongo, whatever it was he was doing, you were there because he was so good. Now he was able to, but he was slow. He was slow in getting his work done, getting his work out. And he was surrounded by a lot of people. And many of them were historians, but they didn't know genealogy and they did not know genealogical records. So when he came to the archives, one of the things Alex Haley was interested in is collecting a group of people who actually knew how to do new archival genealogical records and knew how to do genealogical research for something. He had a grant for the Kente Library Project. So a group of us, the names that Libby, Dr. Clark Lewis already mentioned, include Paul Sluby, who was the first certified African-American genealogist. And he traced his genealogy back to somewhere through his African-American heritage, and then from the plantation, I think it was a Dutch heritage or something like that. I was working with the records for the 1790 census and for free Black servicemen in the American Revolution. If you look at them today, they're just little tiny little tiny catalogs. But in that day, one of the things we talked about is, now we have Ancestry and all sorts of things. But in that day, the students and I were just plowing through the microfilm, trying to make some sense of what we were finding and to make it available to people. When Alex Haley called on a group of us to work with him, we were thrilled, to be able to work with him. But at the same time, we were getting inundated by people who wanted to do their own genealogy. But I think Dr. Clark Lewis will also attest, they didn't want to do their genealogy. They felt that we had their genealogy on file at the National Archives, and all they had to do was stop by and pick it up. And I don't think you can imagine, particularly after Roots was aired, there were lines around the National Archives. There were lines, people trying to get in. And so we tried to begin to space people out, and we tried to give them a little seminar before they went into the microfilm reading room to give them an idea of what they were in for. And all of that made us come together and make a decision. Let's go ahead and form a society, to one of the key purposes of which would be to teach people how to do their genealogy and welcome people into this. So this is 1977. And so we started the organization, people were interested. We ran around at the National Archives and had all sorts of little conferences and things there to acquaint people with the records, tell them what they needed to do. And, you know, those genealogical societies are excellent for sharing records, you know, sharing relationships and things. And so we started back then, and Dr. Clark Lewis was actually doing her genealogy and had a wonderful presentation that I can still tell you about, even though it was 40 years ago. So we began to work together with the public. And again, we had no idea that this was going to take off, but Haley was so popular, the book was so popular, the miniseries had more viewers. It had the record for viewers. First of all, it was the first miniseries that, you know, every day of the week. And then it drew people like nothing before had ever drawn people, I think, other than the moonwalks. That's how we got started in 1977. And it has been a long, good ride watching the evolution of the genealogical field and how it's become the hobby of just so many people, so many families.
Thank you so much for that. And I guess as we talk about those who are kind of following in those footsteps, Dr. Field, how did you begin your work in genealogical research?
Thank you so much. Thank you to Lopez, and it's such an honor to be sharing this panel with Dr. Clark Lewis and with Dr. Newman. This is, you know, I guess for me, I came to this work before I realized it was work through my grandmother's stories. So I was fortunate to grow up near my grandmother, and she was living in East Orange, New Jersey. I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, but the stories she told me were really about Oklahoma. Her family and she herself was from the Black Towns of Oklahoma. And my father had spent his formative years out there in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. And so I grew up hearing these really fantastical stories from the perspective of urban, suburban New Jersey about Black land ownership, about Black and Creek family formation, about the land allotments from 1905, 1906, 1907, about how that her grandfather had built the church, and you could still see the church steps. And eventually we'd start going back there for family reunions. And I got to experience these places. And so I had her stories throughout my upbringing, always kind of, you know, from the kitchen table in my head. I really did not like history. Would not be too strong to say I hated history that I was learning in school. It was mostly the history of presidents and, and the like. And I thought, well, this isn't what I'm interested in. But when I got to college, I had a professor who, for the first time, kind of alerted me to the fact that the stories I'd heard at home actually were not disconnected from American history, African American history, and much more. And from that point on, I started to ask different questions. I took care of my dad the last couple of years of his life. And when he passed away, I was in my 20s. My grandmother and I started going back to Oklahoma. She had two uncles that were 103 and 97, and many of her sisters were still living at the time. And we would ask questions. We would go back every 6 months or so and visit with my grandmother's elders and gather more information. And by this point, I had started a graduate program at NYU with a different topic in mind, but I went to my advisor a few months in, and I shared some of these stories that I was gathering from my own family history. And she said, you really should do something with those. And I remember I said to her, is that allowed? Because I was pretty sure I wasn't allowed to work on my own people. And, we'd carefully read, these books that his history graduate students include, like Peter Novick's That Noble Dream, about the idea of objectivity and how important this was. And so I felt like I had to ask permission. And I was lucky to have several people on my side there that pushed me forward. Martha Hodes, David Leving Lewis, Barbara Katheimer, Michelle Mitchell in the mix. And so, and I was coming through, my graduate studies at a moment when family history was on the rise among professional historians. So I guess I would say, as I said, I came through it through my grandmother's stories. She also had cousins who were, incredibly, they were sometimes conspiracy theorists, but they were really our family historians. So my Uncle Clifford and my Uncle Nathaniel and Andre, they basically, after Roots, had started doing the digging and may have been some of the folks outside that were in line there. And so I had uncles who passed on to me their documents and said, oh, this is your job now? Take these papers. So I had really collaborators throughout, and I learned so much from all my relatives who were with me through that research.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I think quite a few of us came to history. I know I came to history disliking it in K through 12, and then all of a sudden I developed a love for it on the collegiate level, and then learning the stories, and kind of that brought me into history. And I wanted to, just before I moved on and ask the next question, just mention that this session is co-sponsored by the James Dent Walker chapter of ASALH in Washington, D.C. So I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the session. So I just wanted to mention that now, just so everyone knows, and thank them for their support of ASALH, and thank them for their support of this panel. And so, as you mentioned, your family and research, my next question is, what is something interesting or surprising that you found in your research about your own family, and how have they received it? And I ask that because as I've looked at my own history, I found things that my family said, oh, we don't talk about that. We don't want to deal with that. We don't want to look at that. And so, and pardon my correction, it's the James Dent Walker chapter of AUGS, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, not of ASALH, that has sponsored this session. So I do apologize for that misstep. But how has your family reacted to this work?
I can say that when I started, before I'd even shared it with Dr. Lewis and eventually Dr. Quarles and anyone else, I had 4 children living in Washington, D.C., who were the direct descendants of an enslaved man. And they were instrumental in helping me understand his life, his mother's life, and the lives of their 29 siblings. Yes, he had 33 children, 3 wives, and they were instrumental in helping me understand the evolution of an enslaved family in that part of rural Virginia. It's about 30 miles from Success, Virginia. For me, surprisingly, was when I started the work, they were supportive, but in a sense said, well, what do we know? We just know what we lived. And that became really the crux of what I was doing, listening to them. And it was very helpful because they had lots of records that they had saved lots of objects, and they were very willing to share. I think the one thing that was surprising for me almost from the beginning is that they were willing to talk about each other's secrets. And so one of my very first discoveries, one great aunt who knew I had done so many oral interviews finally called me over and said, well, you're going to find out anyway. So she pulled out a picture, and it was she and my other aunt, who was still alive, in these, it was about between 19, they said between 1913 and 1914, in these bathing suits. Of course, they were all the way down to their ankles. They had on shoes, etc., but they were short sleeved, and it had a scoop neck. And she showed it to me, and I was, oh, and I didn't see why it was so shocking. But eventually, a friend who was at that time at the Smithsonian said, well, these kinds of bathing suits would have been very risque for the time. And then she added that they had gotten off the train. They were, like many African Americans from very large Southern families, brought north to work as household workers. So they'd gotten off the train of this senator, spent the day at a beachside community, rented these bathing suits, and wasted, as she recalled, a total of 2 pennies having this grand time at the beach, and then got back on the train, of course, made it to the senator's home, his summer home in New England. But the other sister found out, she had shown me the picture, and the other one said, well, it was her idea. I wouldn't have done it, and Mama wouldn't have known who wasted the money, but it was her idea. They were each trying to blame the other. And the sister that originally showed me the bathing suit said it was the other sister's idea to do it. So frequently, they're always willing to tell stories about each other. And because I was, again, very fortunate to have these 4 living individuals, 2 of my uncles had wives, and they were really willing to tell me everything that the Johnson family couldn't remember. All of the in-laws told me everything. And in particular, one woman, they had been neighbors, and so she knew everything about them. And she told as much as she could to me about points that they conveniently forgot. And so that becomes very helpful. So I think for all of us doing family history, you learn to listen. You don't go in with a mindset of what you want to hear. You go in with questions, and we developed a series of questions, but always keep it open-ended. Record it and listen, and if possible, have them go through pictures and other material culture that helps them remember these mnemonic devices that help them remember. The only other thing I'd like to say is that in the beginning, particularly in the early 1970s, non-African Americans were very less than willing to accept that we had these very structured families, that our families had very full and complete lives, and that we were engaged in culture that didn't involve them. And one of the things that I learned was about, for example, Penny Savers Club, when people couldn't go in banks, or the banks weren't open at the time, household workers and others were available. They had their own banking system, and these kinds of networks. And I remember the National Genealogical Society, when I did a presentation, it just didn't believe me. And it ended up, I wrote an article and was published in the National Genealogical Society Journal about African American history. They just had no idea of how our employment structure, our family educational basis, and of course our culture, how rich and complete the social fabric was without the intrusion of non-African Americans. So I think those are some of the surprising things. Many of us early on doing family history, we were willing to, in many cases, just be very forward and demand that they understand that these weren't historical realities on their terms, but that these were important family and genealogical historical realities that we define. We created them, we defined them, and that they were legitimate, even if they were different from the standard genealogical society and their materials. So it really did force the genealogical community to take a much broader view of history, history of the past, in particular African-American history. And we all were not tracing our families back to some important non-African-American. We were legitimate, our families were legitimate, and that history was critical to the understanding the history of this country. Thank you.
Anyone
I don't do the genealogy, but there is a family member that does. And I was very pleased to find out just within the last couple months that one of my ancestors was a recruiter in Charleston for African colonization. And there's a good letter from this, I think it's the maternal line, something twice or something, 1870s. I can't get that. And but it's a good letter writing to the American Colonization Society, asking for funding for several hundred South Carolinians to return to Africa on board the ASALH. And that was a big deal, this ASALH, because it was not originally an American Colonization Society project. It did happen. I haven't followed up on the research, but every now and then I find something really good. And I also am always comparing in my mind from my mother's stories, particularly the kind of evolution. Dr. Clark Lewis has done so much on migration. You know, how there was pretty much a standard way that the families moved themselves into the North and helped one another. So it's always been very reinforcing, and I quietly always felt that the family historians are often more accurate than the academic historians, just because the family historians really, they're not generalizing. They can really say Uncle Frank did A, B, and C. And so it's always been very thrilling to me.
Well, I'll pick up on that, on the immigration piece there. One of the beginnings of a story that my grandmother used to tell me and anyone else that would listen is Grandpa Coleman went back to Africa with Garvey. That's what she used to say. And it wasn't until I was much older and realized that Garvey, never actually made it to Africa. And I said, well, then who did Grandpa go with? And she's talking about, as it turns out, 1913, 1914, a small back to Africa movement out of the Black towns of Oklahoma called the African movement, sometimes called the Chief Sam movement. But it took, several decades. I was in graduate school by the time I was able to figure out, what was this movement and who was behind it, that my grandmother's grandfather and his family, a couple of his children and his cousin were involved in. And that ended up being a chapter in my dissertation. And then in my first book, reconstructing the Chief Sam movement and the role of my own family in that, and Black Oklahomans more broadly. And I think that that was one of several lines my grandmother would repeat. Another one was Grandpa came to Oklahoma by train, and I would always think, okay, well, why they always repeat that he came by train? Of course, it's because other people were walking, but it was a way of hinting at something, some kind of privilege, without saying where that privilege came from. And, I eventually figured out what was behind that one as well, in terms of the plantation that he came from and the farming skills that he had gathered there and so forth. But over time, what I found was that a lot of the things the two emotions I was working with most of all were pride and shame in this work. So pride, often the things people wanted to tell, the stories they wanted to tell over and over again, that I heard from a very young age. And then on the other side, the whispers and the silences, as has already been mentioned, about the things I didn't really want to talk about. And one of those was my grandmother's Aunt Tabby. Tabitha was her full name and full first name. And my grandmother would say, oh, Aunt Tabby was always all covered up. You could only see the skin on her face. She's totally covered, gloves and so forth. And she would repeat this, especially as she got older, over and over again. And eventually we realized, okay, something happened, before Aunt Tabby came from Mississippi, and it's really remained unspoken what it was that happened. But of course, likely having to do with sexual violence, never the word rape. I mean, these words never came out, but she would reconstruct this image like she was telling us something really important. And so I guess I'll leave it there, but that's been the kind of the duality of a lot of my work in family history has been the stories that people want to tell, and then the silences.
It's so interesting that you each mentioned migration and the effect of migration on the Black family and culture. And so how has migration affected your research? As Dr. Newman mentioned, you went to the National Archives to find your family records, but so often you have to go to state and local historical societies, state archives to find your family histories. And so how has migration helped or hurt your work? So I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Field, since you're still on my screen.
Well, then I'll be very brief. I will say that, when I teach African American history, I often teach as a series of migrations, and we all know here that those are forced migrations, coerced migrations, sometimes something we might call willful migrations, right? But that there's this kind of overlap between the different kinds of migrations. And, I've thought a lot in the course of my work about what that repeated experience of migration and more specifically displacement has meant for family history, right? Leaving behind not just your people very often, for instance, in the course of the Atlantic slave trade or the domestic slave trade, but also leaving behind your stuff, right? Your objects of meaning, your stories, the places you might have stories about, your home place, the resting place of your parents or your grandparents, right? That kind of repeated displacement. A lot of the things that we often associate with reconstructing a genealogy are those things that are repeatedly disrupted in the course of migration and displacement. Now, I think that on the other hand, the tremendous will to remember that we see in Black communities and in African American family history is not incidental, but is directly related to that experience of displacement. And just to give a specific example, my great uncle Clifford, who I mentioned, it was his grandfather who had Monroe Coleman, who had participated in the Chief Sam Back to Africa movement. And Clifford would tell me, oh, there was a fire, but I used to have this photograph. I had a photograph of when they first arrived to the Gold Coast, present day Ghana, in 1914. And it was a photograph of people welcoming them, and they were gonna, find the place where they were going to settle and live out the rest of their lives. That did not come to pass, but the way he would talk about this photograph, which I never saw, and none of us ever really saw, but it had been destroyed in this fire under the less than ideal circumstances.
How about you, Dr. Clark Lewis? I know you've written an entire book on migration.
Yes, and before I start, I think it's wonderful to hear Dr. Newman talk about the connection to the Back to Africa movement, because her dissertation was on that topic. And so to understand it's not just an academic exercise, that it in fact touched her family, even though it took her decades to find out, it's really affirming. I think that one of the many things about migration is that you learn that there are, as was said, spoken and unspoken issues in our culture. And that I would also like to add, I think that when you talk about migration, you see that there's very much a cultural transmission as people left various areas of the South and moved north. You can see it in family coalescing together and working together to get each other employment, et cetera. At least I can say my family and many of the families I studied. In addition, there was a great deal of cultural transmission that people brought, in particular foodways and other activities that very much reflected where they had come from. So they very much brought this culture with them and maintained it, and it becomes a very stabilizing part of their life outside of the rural South. I do think that when you talk about the realities of life of individuals, it was very clear from the research I did after 2 years finding a codicil to a will that a person of the Walden family is, and I had traced that family all the way back to Ravensworth, England. I knew everything about them, every move they made, because it was said our family had always belonged to the Waldens. And so I was trying to get that connection. In a will, it was very clear that this individual that I started with, Peyton Johnson, had been the son of one of the individuals who had owned him. But that wasn't the beginning and the end of the story. And I never felt that was the affirming part of the story, because his mother would go on to have 3 children within an enslaved family marriage. So I do think that that part of what we talk about, spoken and unspoken, it's not affirming, and I don't think it always is, that African Americans have to trace their families back to individuals who are non-African Americans. When I was coming along, everybody was Native, and that just wasn't true. But I do think that as you look at your family and understand and appreciate the realities they faced and how they transcended almost every issue that could possibly be put before them, they did it well, whether it was economic, social. They had strong political lives in terms of civic activities. So we get to see very complete people, even if the historical record is incomplete. Our families, our family history, and our data based on African American realities, it's very complete. And migration helps you understand that bridge that individuals all crossed. And I do think that no matter what, people can understand this cultural transmission. As one of the easier ways is looking at the way food is prepared. North Carolinians versus South Carolinians versus Virginians versus Floridians. It's very, very clearly seen in foodways and in other activities. And so I do think that cultural transmission has to be understood and appreciated on all levels. Thank you very much.
You know, one of the things about migration, and this panel is representing it so well. One of the things I always love to say to my students to shock them at the beginning is that America's boardrooms have always been segregated, even up to today. But Americans' bedrooms have never been segregated. And you've got to understand that in order to understand our history and who we are as a people. The migration, to me, a very hard thing. All of you teach, and our students love to generalize, and the text that we use, unfortunately, often generalize. But what was happening for Black people in Massachusetts, or New York was not the same thing that was happening in Mississippi and Alabama. And it was still something different than what was happening perhaps in California or some of the other places. And that if we get a sense of regionalism, then that helps us. Now, that all comes from just migration from everywhere, right? That if we get this sense of regionalism, we won't move. So the students just love to say, you know, all Blacks were this or all Black, and it was never true. You know, it was never true in our history that we've had a very varied. You know, one of the statistics I always remember from Nell Painter's book about Sojourner Truth was that Charleston brought in the largest number of Africans, but the second largest port was New York City. And as you think about that, people, that's kind of not in people's understanding of that just the history is so complex. And even as I did my research on the Black women who returned to Liberia in the 19th century, and I traced the families, and often, just as we're saying here, sometimes it was just a purchased slave, but other times it was your sister or your aunt or your cousin or somebody that you were helping, and or families you were trying to give another chance to get them together to have another opportunity to live. It just made history as I listened to you, just a few stories. I've just heard a little of Dr. Fields today. That it's just a fascinating history, and it just makes it so much more rich if we understand all of these regional, and I realize everybody can't understand everything, but the regional components, Dr. Clark Lewis is talking about the food, the dress, just this year, you've heard somebody say, what's Juneteenth? So the regional things that happen, it tells a much broader story than we like to just compartmentalize things. But I like the richness of the fabric. Way back in the day, maybe the 70s, the Smithsonian did an exhibit that I loved called A Nation of Nations. And they dealt with all of the different people coming in from different parts of the world, and then how we developed as one small nation, not into a melting pot. I think melting pot, you lose too much of what it was, of the truth, that we each have some aspect of our cultural remembrance that is still very much a part of who we are. Anyway, I think it makes us very rich as Americans, and that if we lose that and we just get to this black, white, home, all this, that you just lose a wonderful richness of who we are.
So as you talked about sort of genealogy and this type of work capturing the richness of sort of American history, as you mentioned, I want to kind of go back and talk about what inspired you both to create or come together to found AUGS. What was the impetus for the foundation of that organization?
Really, it was just it's so hard to say how interested people were. Now, up until that time, let me do it this way. Up until that time, our reading room was filled with women, the daughters of the American Revolution, sons of the American Revolution. It was their hobby. It was what they loved to do. They were very important to us because they had important connections, and they would help us with the Congress in terms of monies that we received, even though at that time we were still under the General Services Administration. Now the Archives is an independent agency, but then we were but they were very, very helpful to us. But all of a sudden, this is not just a discovery of genealogy. I don't think the historians, the Blackest, now we have the Black Lives Matter generation, but we had the Black is Proud generation, young, gifted, and Black. So this rediscovery of African American history was thrilling to many people, particularly to me, out of York, Pennsylvania. I didn't even know we had it in history. That was really thrilling to me, but it was thrilling to many to find out. And then what genealogy does is not just make it that it's generally interesting, but it's interesting to you. So it's one thing if you talk about sharecroppers. It's a whole nother thing when I say, well, my mom was a sharecropper. And I was so stunned when I said, Mom, I was just going to write up this essay on work history. And I said, so when did you begin to work? And she said, when I was 4. And I said, what? And I said, what did you do when you were 4? She said, well, they made you a little hoe. I said, what did you know? She said, all you needed to know is this is what cotton looks like. And anything else that is out there around it is not cotton, it is a weed, get rid of it. So it's simple enough. And she said there were 5 of them and they had 5 O's according to the height of each child. So now I'm not just understanding concept. Now I am seeing how it actually worked in the life of different people, how for all of them, the war, World War II became an opportunity. The one boy went off into the war, made it a career, and ended up being very, very successful. The 4 girls in the family all moved north, all the same quest to get jobs and to do. 2 of them, my mom stopped in New York. She met a guy. 3 of the sisters went further north. They were trying to, they love to say they were trying to get north of racism. And just wonderful, real stories to put into and give flavor to this general history that people have. I think that 67 generation has had phenomenal success in terms of introducing people to African-American history, and that Alex Haley's work and roots and genealogy have been an essential component. Was that good? I didn't answer the prime question. The prime question was interest. There were so many people who were interested. We were so successful. They were so interested. And I mean, we had everybody from guys coming in with cowbells around their neck. One guy was so militant, give me my history. And, you had to say it. It's not like that, that you have to sit down and do your research yourself. And now it's so much, people are interested. Oh my, what a blessing all of these digital resources are. But in the 70s, they were not there. You had to have the willpower to sit in front of those microfilm machines and other documentary sources and do your work. So it's interest, hard to recreate in our minds the phenomenal interest there was in this subject. And it became multiracial. It wasn't just Black history. Now everybody wants to kind of go in, do their history and, get involved in, who their family was. And now I'm so interested that some people go around speaking that I'm a Black descendant of the family and I'm a white descendant of the family, and they come together and kind of present history from the perspectives of the different of how the family grew and developed. I just visited Mount Vernon a couple of weeks ago, and I know that Dr. Clark Lewis was involved in getting recognition for those 300 African Americans who served on that plantation, and a beautiful monument for the cemetery there. That it was a movement that snowballed. I've said too much.
I'd like to add, Dr. Newman-Ham always is so very gracious, because unlike many of us, when we began to meet together as individuals and understanding about our African American history and family history, many of us, there was different ideas. And as Dr. Ham said, she was an archivist and she would tell us all the time, that's all well and good. Let's talk about the archives. Let's talk about the records. And she was very indulgent. But for many of us early on, I know by the time I finished graduate school, I was tired of being in environments where African American sources had to be proven, where you had to take every word someone said and find it affirmed in a record. That was number one. I think that both the National Genealogical Society, and it was then called the Federation of Genealogical Societies, the NGS and FGS, had worked with Jimmy Walker, but there was this sort of exceptionalism that they were willing to say, well, this person, and if you could trace your family back to this white person or that. And many of us had gotten very tired of it. And rather than try to fit in, we were very willing, as Dr. Ham said, to be bold and say, we don't need this, we can have our own organization. And the organization's independence came from our sense of why we had to do this work. It was a legacy that was handed to us, and we didn't need it to go through any filters. I think that no nonsense that Dr. Ham is indicating, from at least those of us at Howard during the takeover years, and I would say all of the people who were founders of the Genealogical Society, and they were not all African American. Ms. Eisenberg from New York and several others, they came with an understanding and an appreciation, and most importantly, a respect for what we wanted to do as family historians, and the idea that there was a historical transmission that did not have to fit in to what NGS, as we said, FGS, Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the Confederacy, we just weren't interested in that. So we had a way of creating an access to our heritage that, as I said, it was okay to be distinct, it was okay to be different, and it was acceptable if things hadn't been done a certain way before. In my case, I was looking at a huge family, most of them household workers, not leaving these extensive diaries, although one aunt did have a diary, but it didn't matter. Her oral records were valid. I would say 98% of what she said was absolutely correct. And as Professor Field said, she talked about the fact that you had what we call grass widows and grave widows, that people's separation and family change happened with many women. The family members either left, they left, they were widows, they hit the grass and they were gone. And so they could leave in different circumstances. Ground widows, of course, were persons whose husbands were killed, but they did not have to fit within the framework of a Eurocentric family and a European ideal. We had our own family members, and so when we came together to create this society, we were willing to make that clear, that family and family history had to be dynamic, it had to change, and that the demographics, whether again it was family, employment, education, culture, what we did was legitimate, and that we were strong enough and it was serious enough to warrant our own organization. I will admit that Alex Haley's roots, it took off in a way none of us could have ever imagined. But at least 5 years before that, there were a large number of us doing African American family history and demanding that its legitimacy be recognized. And so I think that that's all a way of looking at it. And the organization, the founding of this society, really reflected our desire to make sure that we didn't have to fit in, whether it was particularly NGS and the Federation of Genealogical Societies. They said, well, maybe we could have an interest group as if they were doing us a favor. And most of us said no. And we went to a meeting at James Walker's house and we discussed it. And we said, we're going to start our own society and we'll have our own developments and ways of doing things. The big issue was, were we going to certify genealogists? That was always a big fear of NGS, because that's big money for them. And we had no desire to necessarily certify genealogists, because that's being excluding. You're excluding large numbers of people. We wanted to embrace and expand family history to everyone. So ours was not to come up with a standard to make money. Ours was a way of bringing to the largest number of people the richness of family history. And as I said, making sure that social fabric really reflected the diversity of our families as well as the other families. And lastly, as Dr. Ham said, for me in particular, I used a lot of the Mormon records at the Mormon stakes because they have these local libraries. And many people, when they found out what I was doing, when you would talk to them, these family historians, well, these are genealogists basically, they had materials they would share with you. So there was a sense that it was acceptable what you were doing. And in many cases, they applauded you and they supported you. Not everyone. There were lots of people that felt, well, you're talking about things that shouldn't be remembered. As Chris Rock said, in this country, there's a memory of the American Revolution, the Civil War, 9/11, everything else, even things that aren't US based, the Holocaust. But when you want to remember slavery and enslavement and your family, then it's a problem. So I do think that there were many people who applauded what we were doing, but there was resistance on the part of others. But again, as Dr. Ham said, we were bold. Those of us who decided we were going to do it, we did it. And I just think it makes our stories, the society and the African American Historical and Genealogical Society, it made us stronger because sometimes we had to push against all these other realities. And Dr. Ham didn't say, but she developed and designed our logo. So each of us brought different skill sets. She always likes to say, I'm not a genealogist, but she was doing a lot of that heavy lifting for all of the genealogists and family historians working in the organization. Thank you.
You know, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And this is something that you all kind of brought up in both of your answers. And I actually want to direct this question to Dr. Field, in that you talk about respect and you talk about legitimacy. And there is in the historical profession this sort of, I won't say friction, but there is a sort of different view in how public historians and family historians are viewed versus academic historians. And so for you, Dr. Field, I just wanted to, if you could tell me about the changing role of genealogy and family history in the context of the historical profession and academia as you see it, particularly as you've done your recent work, you had your seminar and you have your new book coming out.
Sure, thank you so much. I've just been riveted by the stories of the founding. It's really exciting to hear both of your perspectives, and I really appreciate it. So to this specific question, you know, I felt just incredibly lucky to have been given permission, so to speak, to write my doctoral dissertation and then my book that came out of that, tracing my own ancestors. And that kind of led me into a series of questions that come out of the historical profession, but also the Black intellectual tradition more broadly, about the relationship between history and memory, and the kind of myth of objectivity that of course the historical profession was built upon in many ways in the United States. And so I started to kind of dig into the long history of early Black historians and what their relationship was between their scholarship and their own family histories, and namely W.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, Anna Julia Cooper, and a number of others, and to see the ways in which they navigated that. Because of course I felt like I had to ask permission in the early 2000s. Adele Logan Alexander probably is the one person's books that were openly about her own ancestors prior, you know, in that period before that I thought, okay, but she also wasn't announcing it in her early works as much. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't, I'm using the first person, or let me tell you about my grandmother, you know? So I was kind of interested in going back and figuring out how this had happened, right? And so Carter Woodson, we know both of his parents were formerly enslaved, right? He's writing about the history of slavery. W.B. Du Bois has stories of slavery within his family history, has a bit of a song that he carries forth into Souls of Black Folk and Beyond. And yet his family history is never to cross paths with his dissertation on the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And so I wrote an article over the last couple of years, kind of narrating some of that, what it meant for these early historians who were trying to be kind of legitimated by the white historical profession to also engage with their own family histories. And in fact, I came across a kind of a treasure trove of material, and I'll just talk a little bit about Du Bois here. Hand sketched not just family trees, but a family crest in his own hand. Tons of letters to cemeteries, to relatives, Black and white. Of course, trips to Haiti, trips to the Bahamas. His own attempt at beginning a family history that might, that has footnotes. And so I started writing about this. I thought, it's really fascinating. Nothing really came of this work beyond his personal life, right? And yet he was trying to figure out how to engage personally as well as professionally with history, capital H. So that's some of what I've been, that's that piece that I've been working on the past couple of years. And, the reason was not just my own, what a privilege it was to be able to write about my own ancestors, but also the fact that there's now this, kind of chorus of professional historians who are engaging their own family members in, not just in memoirs later in life, but kind of in their scholarship right now. And so that's part of what I've been up to.
Could I just add also, oral history in general was in a battle right then. John Van Zena came out with his book about oral history in Africa. And, there were a lot of people that said if you couldn't write it down, it wasn't history, so that this was a huge battle. And the other part of the battle that you were speaking about, Dr. Matthews, is not just genealogical historians, but public historians. Could that person actually be considered an academic? Howard did not. And one of the ways that to demonstrate that is that this Black History Guide that I did for the National Archives came out at about the same time I finished my dissertation, because Howard would not even begin to consider that a work that was a guide to help people and is still in print and is still helping people today, even though it came out in 1984. But they still use it, and my students tell me they still use it in the reading room at the archives, and many people have been a part of it. But that wasn't considered academic. And actually, I had an ongoing battle with Dr. Harris, who wanted to send me into the academy. But we had one funny story I later on was the chief editor of a team of Library of Congress people, and we did another guide to the African American mosaic, to Black history materials in all fields at the Library of Congress. And when Dr. Harris, he spoke at our conference, when he saw it in 1994, he said, okay, Dr. Ham, it's all right to be a public historian.
That's very true. And I'd like to add, however, that at least at Howard, it may not have been embraced for you to be, as Dr. Ham said, a public historian. You were expected to be innovative. With the history of people who'd worked directly with Dr. Woodson, having several lectures with Dr. John Hope Franklin, or being in a class on oral history with Dr. Uya, and I'm sitting there with Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who's now at Harvard, Bernice Reagan, a long history at the Smithsonian, John Fleming, Rosalind Terborg Penn, so many others who are stellar scholars. They absolutely were educated about the legitimacy of oral history. I do think a great deal of that goes back to Dr. Williams, Dr. Lorraine Williams, who possibly clearly came before Dr. Harris, but she encouraged innovation. And as I said, even if it wasn't something she necessarily loved, she would figure a way to make it legitimate. Also, frequently African Americans, in my mind, are not always as aware of how important our work is for the broader historical community. When I was elected to the Organization of American Historians Board, I was startled at how many of the board members read very closely the materials that came out from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. They were very, very, very solicitous and very interested in the work that the AAHS, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and many of the local African American societies, much of what they're doing. I often was startled at how willing they were to share the information that they were getting from African Americans with me, but it frequently wasn't reflected in all of their research. And I think in many cases, they were always very tentative about these realities or the materials that we were working with. On the other hand, African American scholars from George Washington Williams up through Dr. Woodson, as I said, Dr. John Hope Franklin, and many, many others, they were bold and willing to make sure that the world knew the legitimacy of African American history and culture, and their willingness to stand on it. And I think that helps us understand how, for example, the museum in Washington, the National African American Museum, has informed the museum community, much like its predecessor, the Anacostia Museum, that would boldly do one of its first installation on rats. African Americans frequently are doing the innovative work, even if we don't always want to give ourselves credit. And I share with Dr. Ham the reticence of some scholars to recognize public history, which is what I was brought to Howard in 1990 to create a public history department and to create a program. And all of my colleagues weren't necessarily supportive of it. But as she said, as they moved along and understood, we were literally the direct legacy of Dr. Woodson and many others who spent their lives as public historians, even if the term doesn't come into being in non-African American communities until 1979 with the organization of the Public Historical Society. And in serving on that board, that was one of the things that, again, I was struck by how much they knew about what we were doing as public historians, not frequently giving us credit for it, but they were very interested in it and they respected it on many levels.
Can I add one more thing? I really appreciate this conversation, and it seems, there's now many other historians, non-African Americans, who are writing about their family histories as well. But everything that I've found, like the first of these, as your comment attests, right, began in African American history. So this kind of the willingness to engage, oral history and also one's own ancestors began in Black history very clearly, and especially at Howard and other HBCUs, and now it's expanded to the mainstream of the historical profession in ways that I think are not acknowledged nearly enough. In fact, the kind of mode of doing public history and publicly engaged work is something that I didn't know the term public history when I came out of graduate school, and then all of a sudden there was I'd heard it, but I didn't think that necessarily related to what I was doing, and yet my uncle was reading my dissertation chapters, and we were going to cemeteries together in Mississippi and Alabama, and I thought, oh, we're going, this actually, later on, I realized, oh, this was public history all along. We're organizing memorials. We're having, celebrating the centennial of the Chief Sam movement. And then I started to talk about it as public history, but it just came quite naturally that, of course, we do this work alongside, our families and our communities.
I just wanted to tell Dr. Fields that a couple people are asking. You mentioned an article you did, that if you could give them the title and the site for the article. I don't know which one there.
It's not out yet, but I'll write it in here. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Dr. Ham. I was trying to keep up in the chat with the questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A so that they don't get lost in the chat, because, as the chat goes, questions float away. So to help me out with asking your questions at the end, please put your questions in the chat. So thank you all for that. One of the things that I wanted to hit back to is you all three of you do this type of work, and how has technology or the change in technology helped with doing this work?
No question. It's, I spent hours. In our day, if you were going to read all the articles and books and review everything that you needed for your comprehensive exams and things, you had to go to the library, find the journals. Few of the journals were available on microfilm, but you still had to go. And so I literally encamped at libraries. So to me, JSTOR is almost next to heaven. That the ability to be able to pull up articles, and now there's just not so much footwork. We used to get seasick with the microfilm machine, but now you could just handle things better, and it's much better for comparative analysis, because so much of the material, we would be making a lot of generalizations back in the day. We might be able to look at a couple hundred documents and then make some generalizations, but now we can look at thousands of documents, thousands of articles. I mean, it still takes time, but it is not so much travel time. And that's what is just wonderful to me.
Well, as a family historian, I think, as Dr. Ham has said, we used microfilm, and that was considered for many family historians a move forward because they were going through the raw data. So we at least had microfilm, and in my case, I could use the materials from all across the country by going to the different Mormon stakes, and they would order the microfilm and bring it in from different counties, different areas, etc. I think, of course, moving it forward in terms of technology, we have to talk about the impact of Ancestry and people doing DNA that has moved it to a whole different level. So I think all of these are important new tools that affirm the significance of family and family history and have been very helpful for individuals doing genealogical research. But I really believe you have to have a foundation. And for many families, that foundation is the oral history, and using those local and family records, cemetery records first, and then building upon that with the technology. But there's no question that technology has had a great impact, and it has been very helpful to individuals doing family history on every level. And you have an individual like, for example, Dr. Matthews, who came from a background that he was a computer science major. And therefore, when he comes to history, he brings that skill set that enhances his historical research on every level. And I just think that there is that meshing, I think also of a brilliant scholar like Dr. Kito Swan, who's using resources in looking at the African diaspora and family history in the Pacific, in the Caribbean and South America, Central America. He's moving family history at light speed. And so I think all of this is very important to how we can enhance and do family history, but you still have to be willing to do that hard foundation work as a family historian and as you're creating these genealogical studies, which will blossom into family history studies.
Well, I will just say that you mentioned DNA, and one of the questions in the chat, it's kind of scrolled away, but was what do you think the role of DNA testing and like Ancestry does DNA, Gina Page, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, she does African Ancestry. What do you think the role of DNA testing is in terms of doing this family history? Because I'll say one of the things that interests me about the DNA history is just how it kind of can pinpoint you where your ancestors come from, you know. And one of the questions I had for Dr. Page when if she was going to be here was, what do you do about the someone just wrote in our chat, the unintended consequences of this DNA testing? Like, you get the test and all of a sudden one of your distant family members winds up in jail because they found them from your DNA test. So do you all have any thoughts about that? I just wonder. I know she's not here, but do you have any thoughts about that?
I think its benefits far outweigh its problems. I'll admit I haven't had the DNA testing on, but those are personal issues that I have. But I think that it is an important tool. Like many aspects of profit-making activities, I'm not always sure that it is as valid as they make it. But I think for people who have it as an interest, it is important. I'm very sorry she's not here because I have a number of questions also. But I think that for those persons who see it as a tool, it shouldn't, to me, it should not be the total answer that people look for, but it is a tool, an important tool in terms of technology and broadening our sense of how your family fits into a broader area of history, world history, etc.
I'll just I'll say that, you know, I've been skeptical like many historians. However, it's been quite powerful to watch how many family members, you know, every few months, you know, forward me their DNA results. And the way that it's caught fire, you know, in ways similar to, you know, the immediate aftermath of Roots, is certainly, you know, I think as historians, you know, worth tracking and tracing. You know, there's for me, it's the stories, right? It's the stories that keep me doing this work, and those stories and those silences I find in the oral history and in the interviews and conversations, diaries, more than anywhere else, and certainly more than a DNA test. But I've seen people, you know, usefully interweave these different kinds of evidence.
So I think looking at our time, I'm going to start asking some questions that we have in our chat. And thank you so much for submitting your questions. The first question is from Amber Sansbury. And she says, I appreciate the ability to ask questions. In my case, my upcoming dissertation examines the role of Head Start programs in integrating Black families' histories, family ways of knowing, and racial socialization processes for child development. In history about Black families, are you all aware of research about the first Black teachers, often family members, church leaders, or neighbors, who taught Black children in family members' homes before school integration? I'm interested to see if and how early teacher records have been captured in family histories.
I can say Howard had a grant a number of years back to look at the African American records in a small community in Maryland, and the teachers had these records back to Reconstruction, and they refused to turn them over to the Historical Society. So Howard had a grant to work with the teachers. Dr. Richardson Goddard did a book, and I would suggest that you look at the book by Dr. Goddard on these early records, because it gives you a very good way of a segue into this kind of community-based research. Another study that is going to be intriguing, I feel, is Ms. Brenda Zonders at Howard is doing a study on the very first teachers who integrated schools in Texas, and the fact that in many cases they were expected to not only be teachers, but counselors and everything else they were expected. Also, I know that Dr. Barbara White did a dissertation at Maryland on some of the first Black teachers in Maryland. So there are a number of studies that look at these first teachers and the way they were engaged in the community. Many of them begin in Reconstruction and help us understand demographically what African American teachers in these various settings did and the records that can be used. I think they're, again, when you go to their bibliographies, you see the richness of these studies. There was a study of the Black teachers in Prince Edward County when you said doing the studies or doing the teaching in their homes when they shut down the schools. And in Prince Edward County, Virginia, and I'm so embarrassed I can't remember the young woman's name who did the book, but I thought she did the work as her PhD at Morgan. And it was a wonderful study of how the teachers in this community, this rural community, when in response to segregation, the white community refused to integrate, they for almost 5 years maintained a separate school system for the Black students. I think she was Dr. Ham's student. And so I will allow her to go forward with that point.
No, I think it was Dr. Amy Tillerson that she
Right.
did that. And I know you were on her committee. I think you were on her committee, but I'm not sure the book is out yet. But I know she's been working on it. I was just going to make the point that teacher records are local records, and local, it depends on where and when and how diligent the community may have been or the criteria they had, relating to teachers. So that's a little bit more iffy in terms of coming up. There was also a great difference in terms of communities and things. I was surprised to learn that the whole stereotype of the old maid school marm was because teachers in many places, once they married, were not allowed to continue to teach. So if you wanted to be a teacher for your profession for life, you had to decide that you were going to be single. So there are all sorts of things that are a little bit more elusive when you get to them. So it's a good idea to focus on a community to see what a community has as an example of who the teachers were. And we were always, the Freedmen's Bureau records it's all over the place in terms of the teaching, but there is it's a very rich tapestry. One of my students did his dissertation just on Prince George's County here in Maryland, immediately after the Civil War, where local people working with benevolent societies near and far and the Freedmen's Bureau began to establish schools for liberated African Americans, and excellent history of how some people were willing to donate land and help, and other people were ready to burn the schools down and drive the teachers away. So it's a varies very much from community to community, north and south.
I would encourage you also to look at the records of schools like North Carolina Central. They have and continue to have a series of lectures on African American teachers. It's part of the Helen Edmonds series at North Carolina Central. I know South Carolina State, I know Cheney. These had been strong. Cheney had been called Cheney State Teachers. And so they have a huge number of educational records, many of the African American institutions, which are frequently overlooked for the richness of their archives and archival records. So I do think that that is, as Dr. Ham said, that's a critical part of how you get to understand these educators and looking at the educational institutions they matriculated at and the importance these institutions, primarily historically African-American institutions, placed on teaching and the creation of important curriculums, et cetera.
All right, well, our next question is from Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and she asked, do you think that oral history also got a boost with the shift in the historiography of slavery in the 1970s, when scholars began to revisit the 1930s WPA interviews of the former enslaved in order to get their understanding?
I can say a couple words about this. I absolutely yes, and also thinking of John Blasingame's slave testimony in 1977, and Blasingame, of course, had noted that between 1902 and something like 1972, there had been only like 3 state studies of slavery that used even a bit of enslaved people's own voices, right? And so that just the the vast majority, with very, very few exceptions, were using, white records, white people's voices, government records, and so forth, to the exclusion of Black voices. I also, it got me thinking about the ways that individuals' own family histories shaped what happened more publicly, right? But the role of that family history was kind of suppressed within those movements. So I talked a little about Black history and through Woodson and Du Bois, but also the collection of folklore. Zora Neale Hurston's own family history, of course, shaped a great deal of her work. The New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance, Hughes and many others, of course, bringing their family history into this like memorialization of the ex-slave. And then to connect a little bit to Howard, one of the people I've written about over the last few months is Ophelia Settle Egypt, whose papers are there at Howard. And she is, by my view, the person responsible for the first effort to collect ex-slave narratives prior to the WPA effort and others, under the direction of Charles Johnson. But the way that happens, of course, as my fellow panelists probably well know, is she remembers stories of her own grandmother. And she said, I was supposed to be collecting stories of social conditions in Black Nashville, and instead I heard about her childhood experiences as a slave. And I said, I want more of this. And she goes to Charles Johnson and says, I want to do this because she's remembering her grandmother and her grandfather's stories about their own childhood experiences of enslavement. And so I think that there's just countless examples of that, of, someone's out there doing the job that's that can be written, the job that can be paid, right? And then they change course because of their own family history. But that piece of the story doesn't always carry forward into the future.
I wanted to add, she said slave testimony, but also slave community, the book, that I remember it was such a phenomenon when it came out, and Blasingame was such a phenomenon because to listen to the slaves, when you had all these good white people saying things, why should anybody listen to the slaves? And then to say that you could do a whole book, you could do a whole study, you could go back and reconstruct from the narratives and things. So let's just say it was not only interesting, it was just really exciting. And the debates, I love historical debates. The debates were wonderful because it got you to really thinking about how do you do things? How do you establish the truth? Are you seeing themes? As I read through narrative after narrative, somewhere in all of them, they seem to say they treated us like cattle. And somewhere in all of them, they said, we had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, there were all of these things that were kind of thematic in there as you look at them. So it was a very exciting time. I think it made a tremendous difference as we look forward with the technology and we look back, and we were even able to reconstruct a few voices with the early technology of the recorders. They were even able to record some of these people so that we could hear them. That was just wonderful to me.
I also think there was a willingness to look at history, established history, through what we were calling a lens of culture. Mr. Blassingame had been at Howard and boldly decided how he could do his dissertation and was able to complete it at Yale. But I also think when you have individuals coming like Dr. Okan Uya and others who were trained as Africans, Dr. Uya was an African, but he understood how you could take the theories of African oral traditions, which were growing in respect in the 50s and 60s, and apply it to African American research. And his book, Kingdoms of the Savannah, we had to read it in his class and then think about how you could use these same theoretical constructs in African American oral history. And I know that understanding how you could use that, as we were calling it then, that lens of culture, that everything we were reading and what we were doing as young scholars, we wanted it to make it applicable to the African American experience. And we were bold and willing to do that. And so I think the oral histories that had been, in many cases, in a sense, kept in the realm of anthropology, sociology, were becoming more important to historians. And even though many traditional historians didn't embrace this aspect of history, slowly but surely it was important. And I do think that it was not a small consequence that Howard had probably one of the very first oral history classes that focused on not just oral traditions and understanding its African applications, but a willingness to also see how its applications would be formidable for African Americans. I can remember when we were talking, and I was just thinking about, we had all these categories, and one of them was fixed versus freeform categories. And I used in my example the blessing that this enslaved ancestor had 3 wives, and children of each of the 3 wives said a blessing before the meal that was particular to their mother. So I could trace aspects of these 3 marriages through something as fixed, a fixed testimony, like the blessing that was said.
Did we lose Dr. Clark Lewis? Or is it my
that was respected in Africa could and should be applied to the African American experience?
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark Lewis. We have in the chat, so that Dr. Field actually, Linda Critchlow White asked, she said, you mentioned that Adele Logan Alexander was one of the first people to tell history in terms of her own family history. Can you explain more about that and tell us who were some of the early writers of history from their family's genealogy point of view? I am familiar with Dr. Alexander's works, and before today never realized that she was one of the first to write in that way.
I think I should actually defer to Dr. Clark Lewis on on this question in some way, because you know, Adele Alexander did her PhD at Howard, had begun some of this research. My understanding is she'd begun this research, you know, prior to pursuing the doctorate, you know, in her personal life with her family members, and then later decided to go and pursue a degree, I think with the encouragement, I'm going to get this wrong, of Rosalind Turberg Penn, I believe. So that's part of the story that I know, but you know, again, I think there were many people doing this, but more, you know, quietly, because of the obligations or the perceived mandates of the historical profession. And then, of course, if we think about Black history and the Black intellectual tradition beyond the profession, there were tons of people doing genealogical research and African-American family history, working on their own ancestors, but not necessarily with a PhD on the line, you know, not necessarily at risk of, entering the profession or not. So.
I think that what Dr. Fields said is correct, but I would invite individuals who have this as an interest to understand there were a huge number of individuals in graduate school who all incorporated family history in their research. Dr. Olive Taylor, I was thinking of dissertations at Howard, Dr. John Fleming in the 1950s, Dr. Brown, Letitia Brown. We could go on and on and on. And I don't think it is unique to Howard, but I do, because she was at Harvard. But I do think Dr. Brown, Letitia Brown, was at Harvard. But many, many scholars. Dr. Woodson incorporated a significant part of his family history and lineage in his research. So it's an ongoing part of the African-American scholarship and scholarly tradition. Whether others chose to recognize it, that possibly is another issue. But I think that it is a part of this cultural continuity that is significant to African-American scholars who are doing history to always incorporate family history. I just think it is part and parcel of what they did. It's, for example, it's interesting. People will say, well, during, quote, Negro History Week, end of quote, African-American scholars would speak on a variety of topics. Well, you were expected during this time to speak on Negro history. People didn't care if your area was French Renaissance music. You had a degree, you were expected to share your knowledge with the community. And that's why I think the whole idea and ideal of public history is part and parcel to what African Americans have always done. You were expected, no matter what your area of research was, it had to have a public presentation. And even if you didn't want to, there was always a family member that would say very quietly or very boldly, oh, I have a niece or nephew or cousin or something, and they can speak for Negro history. And you might caution them, well, I don't do X, Y, or Z. And they could give you a certain look like, okay, but you're still going to do it. And you did it. So I do think this ideal about public history and how it's been central to what we've always done, it's just what was done, whether it was, I think of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham that talks about going to the offices of Dr. Woodson with a grandfather and eventually with a father. And it was just expected that you would do this kind of, quote, Negro history work. He was a minister. People had all types of backgrounds, but you were expected to incorporate this data and this knowledge and to dispense it to the wider community.
But I would argue that it was Alex Haley who made it popular. You know, as he told the tales and went back to Gambia and did his whatever he did, he was just magical. I don't know how historical he was, but he was absolutely magical in terms of his presentation. And that is exactly what we needed at that time to at least get people, you know, we were analyzing language, we were doing all sorts of things in terms of, you know, what did this, he said he would go, what did this word mean? And he went to the scholars, I think at Wisconsin or someplace, to analyze words and things. And it just became kind of doable as he began to introduce us to Kunta Kinte and this history. And the popularity, I think, just really helped, was a good boost. Libby's, Dr. Clark Lewis is saying what the community had been doing all of these years. Yes, that is true. but it wasn't popular yet, and it certainly hadn't pierced the scholarly community yet as a valid means of discussion. But slowly, you know, that this was happening, and I think Alex Haley was a great boost in this area.
Absolutely. He was a catalyst that, as you said, not only if anyone heard him tell the story, it was, as you said, it was magical. You came away totally changed. It made you reframe much that you knew and learned about history. Absolutely. And I think by the fact that ABC took the chance to tell this story and have it broadcast, and they did it in January, and there was a huge snowstorm in a significant part of the country. It's as if everything came together to get people to sit and watch. And they did, as Dr. Newman-Ham said, in record numbers. And it was transforming for the entire country. But I think it resonated with African Americans in a very special way. And so I absolutely agree. She's absolutely right that this idea and this ideal of popular culture and presenting it to a broader public, it was transforming for everyone who was alive at that point.
So speaking of oral history, Dr. Linda Critchlow White asked in the chat, the first time today that you designed the logo, Dr. Newman-Ham. Nice to know that history. Several of us have wondered exactly what the tree image on the logo symbolizes. Since you designed it, can you explain it?
I think Paul Sluby and I both worked on the logo, and it's just, if you turn it on the side, it's a genealogical graph, and then if you it's too small to show it here, but then I turned the graph up and made it a tree, family tree, genealogical tree. What the other part, you know, Africa, you know, say we obviously, Dr. Clark Lewis and I were both very impressed by the work of Okana Uya. We were both in his classes when he was at Howard. And, you know, then the term, now it's African diaspora, then the term was Pan-Africanism, and this whole, the connection, the, you know, the roots going back and forward. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, it was a very interesting time in our history. Let me.
Well, while you do that, would anyone like to comment on the role of historical fiction in writing family history? A lot of people don't realize that Roots was technically fiction. Dr. Field.
I think that there's a lot of different ways, obviously, to write family history, and there's a move towards more narrative writing, literary writing, and the profession generally. Certainly, I think developing characters within a family history is an exciting thing when you have the documents or the oral history or stories that can lead you in that direction. In my own work, there's been a lot, I had to do a lot of kind of speculation to get at what I was most interested in, which is the interior lives of, my father's family. And so to do that, I would often, if I didn't have any words from, say, a particular great-great-grandfather, I might look to who was next door on the census, and did descendants of that person recover or preserve any documents or stories, who was across the street on the census, to kind of expand outward to reconstruct a neighborhood or a community in order to lend, some kind of texture to an interiority to the life that I was initially pursuing. So that's just kind of one method, and it's not fiction per se, but it's definitely required a lot of imagination and speculation, also drawing on literature um, and folklore to some extent.
I would take the position that when you talk about the Iliad, the Odyssey, A Tale of Two Cities, I mean, historical fiction takes on so many different aspects. And the reality is, particularly when you are taking a work to a publisher, it is not going to have the same framework that it will have as a dissertation. They tell you point blank, all that terrible and long and arduous research you did, that was all well and good, but it has to be something that engages the public. So I do think that historical works just cannot have that same dry academic base and voice as a dissertation, number one. Number two, as a historian, you are writing for a broader public, and you have to keep that in mind. When you look, for example, the first edition of, for myself and Dr. Newman Ham, our Bible, From Slavery to Freedom, it's very different than the more recent editions. They have to be more readable. And anyone doing historical research, I don't care who it is, when you are publishing it and when you're taking it to the broader public, and particularly public historians, we understand that the records, the objects, and all of the things we have found must resonate from the lives of people. And you have to be able to interface this data with people. It's not enough just to research it and it sits in a library. And I think that's one of the important aspects of organizations like the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, African American Historical Genealogical Society. We unapologetically, we are absolutely firm that these stories, this material must get back to the public. And we are very anxious to share this and to share historical research with the broader public.
I was actually dumbfounded when I saw Roots, the book, and realized it was, that he had given dialogue and the whole business. I had never envisioned that that's what he was doing. And so, I don't know, it just shocked me that that was what he produced. Yet I still think it prompted all of the different kinds of things that we're talking about today, that people were personalizing, Chicken George and, and all of it. And children were asking, Southern white kids were asking their parents questions that people never hoped to get asked about their people, or the different kinds of things that were a part of our American past. So I'm still very thankful for it, but, and I understand what Dr. Clark Lewis is saying, that, what you do in the academy and what you do for the public, for the general public, are two different kinds of things. But I was still shocked when I saw the book that it wasn't, that he didn't take it, that he did not write it on a more scholarly level.
But he was a writer. I mean, the other work that he'd done was the autobiography of Malcolm X, which had that same kind of compelling data. So you're absolutely right. All of us could talk with him and work with him. And as she said, every scholar everywhere, he was so open. He traveled everywhere. But I think he understood in writing this book, he had to write it in a way that the general public would embrace. I mean, when it first came out, it was unheard of. They had an exhibit or an installation of the books in a bookstore in Washington, and people literally, because there were so few that could be sold, people were literally working hard to try to figure out how to steal the book. And they would take the book and then put the money on the counter and go out. they were so anxious to get the knowledge. So I think what Dr. Ham is saying is exactly right. This helped us reframe African American history and African Americans, period. There was a new sense of pride that I don't think, maybe James Brown, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. There are these episodic issues, but you can trace them. And I do think, without question, for history, roots changed everything. And she's absolutely right.
You also, if you're African American, you also probably have a sense, as we're dealing with the earlier generations, that some people were so ashamed of slavery, so ashamed of the slave past, that old slave music and slave this and slave that, that they were shoving into the corner our history and trying very, very hard to integrate and kind of ignore that past. And here was a new generation coming up with this, no, we cannot ignore who we were. Plus, we made amazing contributions to build this land, to build this country. Plus, how can you understand the phenomenal development of African Americans as a political group, as a people group, as a cultural group, unless you understand our past? So here we had something, that was just a wonderful phenomena, and I was just very, very pleased to be a part of it.
I think that when you talk about shoving into the corner, if African Americans had a portion of their history in the corner, established historians made sure that there was a fence around it, that they couldn't get out of the corner, that if you were going to get published, if you were going to be a part of the established historical community, you had to do acceptable, in a Eurocentric way, research. So even if you were the most brilliant scholar, you better make sure that if you're talking to the OAH or the AHA or these local historical societies, they're going to make sure that the history you bring is the history they want. It's not reciprocal. It's clearly, for a very, very long time, it's one way. And so you have individuals who are working in history who don't even know the cultural continuity of African American scholarship. We went to a conference in Boston. A group of Howard students went, and we were amazed at a woman standing there saying she was going to be the first African American to get a PhD in sociology. And it was laughable. She'd gone to historically non-African American communities and she bragged about it. She had no sense of our contributions. So people who are in these environments, I really go back to exceptionalism. Somehow they're made to feel they are doing something that's so different and so special. It's because the persons with whom they're being educated have no idea about us and our institutions and our contributions. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily valid.
Well, thank you for that. And with that comment, I'm going to bring us to a close. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Dr. Newman-Ham. Thank you, Dr. Clark-Lewis. Thank you, Dr. Field, for sharing your thoughts and sharing your work with us. Remember, Dr. Field's book, The Stories We Tell, is coming out shortly or soon or eventually. Okay.
Probably another year or so.
Hey, well, we'll keep our eyes out for it. And so thank you all so much for being with us today. And we really appreciate all of you for listening to us and joining us today. And we have about a minute left. And so we're on this automated system and it's going to cut us off. So I just want to thank you all again and have a great day and continue to enjoy the ASALH convention.